what was the single biggest problem medieval armies faced when everyone started wearing armor that ordinary swords couldn't touch? Today you'll meet the deadly inventions that turned the battlefield upside down. We're counting down the 7 weapons so brutally effective they forced knights and kings to rethink how wars were fought, starting with a tool that could crush steel like it was tin foil. You've seen the movies, right? Knights clash, swords flash, and somehow a blade just glides through a steel helmet like it's a watermelon. Here's the letdown. Real medieval armor laughed at swords. Hollywood likes to show knights falling left and right, sliced like bread. The truth is almost the exact opposite. By the late Middle Ages, if you walked onto a battlefield, you'd see steel everywhere. Knights, and even regular soldiers strapped on metal from head to toe. Some looked pretty impressive, covered in polished plates and fancy visors, all clicking and clanking when they moved. It was like walking around in a personal tank, one designed to keep you alive when everything else could kill you in 2 seconds flat. But nobody tells you what this meant for the poor souls stuck fighting them. Regular folks, mercenaries, men-at-arms, unlucky peasants pulled onto the line, could swing their best sword all day, and it would barely scratch the paint. Imagine lining up against a rival, swinging with everything you have, and your blade just slides off a curved metal surface. Over and over, the only thing getting cut is your pride. Even the most legendary swords didn't do much against well-made plate armor. It wasn't about how sharp or shiny your sword was. Armor was getting smarter, thicker, and more flexible. Some armors were so good that researchers testing them today have to use modern machines just to leave a mark. So what did all this tough steel mean for the actual fighting? For centuries, swords were the star of the show. Everyone wanted a good blade. But as armor spread, soldiers realized their old tricks weren't working now. Even upgraded swords with fancy edges and new shapes were struggling to keep up. Some swords tried narrowing their tips to sneak through the little holes or joints. Others doubled down with bigger, heavier blades trying to bludgeon their way through. But the real winner of this arms race wasn't another sword. It was a weapon few people had taken seriously before things got this desperate. Now, here's where things get interesting. When you look at reports from medieval battles, something strange shows up. There aren't as many sliced-up bodies as you'd expect. Instead, researchers found that sword wounds dropped off during the big battles. Instead, injuries from crushing blows spiked, literally. Blunt force trauma was the new leading cause of battlefield injuries. People weren't getting chopped in half. They were getting battered like meat in a kitchen. Skulls weren't split by clean blade cuts, but compressed, shattered, or mashed in by heavy objects. Archaeologists find grave after grave with helmeted heads smashed flat or bones snapped like twigs, even though the body is dressed in layers of solid steel. It wasn't that plate armor was bad. It's actually a work of genius for what it does. Sharp weapons? Totally useless, unless you got really lucky or aimed for an armpit. Plate made swords cry, but it left one annoying problem. No matter how good your suit, there are limits to how much force your body can take before important bones turn to powder. The logic shifted overnight. If you can't cut armor with a blade, maybe you can just smash the guy wearing it. And if you've ever tried cracking a nutshell with your fingers, you understand why people started looking for bigger, harder tools. Weaponsmiths saw the writing on the wall. People started making hammers, maces, and blunt weapons that made use of pure, raw impact. If swords were scalpels, precise but limited, these new weapons were sledgehammers, meant to break bones and send shockwaves through armor straight to whatever unlucky soul was inside. There were stories about knights with dented armor who survived the battle, only to find out later they'd broken ribs or worse, just from being hit so hard. The magic trick of medieval armor wasn't invincibility. It was turning anyone with a sword into someone swinging wet noodles. The downside? Any weapon that could channel real power into a single, small point, a hammer, a mace, even a spiked stick, suddenly became a lot scarier than some fancy sword. The stage was set for a truly unforgiving weapon, one that wasn't about elegance or traditions, but about making sure whoever wore the armor regretted it as soon as they got close enough. So you've got all these tough knights clanking around, certain nobody can touch them. But what happens when an enemy comes along with something that doesn't care about sharpness at all? The next weapon in our countdown turned plate armor from a superpower into a terrifying risk. Let's see what happens when someone brings a warhammer to a sword fight. Now picture yourself suited up in full plate armor. You've got steel wrapped around every inch of your body, and all that gear is designed to laugh in the face of swords. Maybe you're even feeling a little cocky, thinking you're safe from the usual medieval mayhem. But then, out of the corner of your visor, you spot an opponent pacing toward you, swinging what looks like an oversized hammer. This is where things start going badly, because while plate armor was great at stopping sharp blades and arrows, it didn't do so well when all that force homed in on one point. That's exactly why the warhammer exploded onto the scene. On the surface, it looks pretty basic, a stick with a chunk of metal stuck to the end. But this thing was medieval engineering at its most unforgiving. Not flashy, not fancy, just dangerous. The warhammer's big secret was that it didn't need a weak spot in your armor to do some damage. Unlike a sword, which had to hunt around for a gap or a soft spot, the warhammer made its own. One side usually had a flat, heavy face, a bit like the business end of a judge's gavel, but much heavier. Swing that at someone's helmet, and even the best steel could crumple. The other side was where things got mean. That's where they'd put a spike, or sometimes even a hooked beak. Now you had a tool that wasn't just for smashing. The spike let you jab right through thinner areas or twist into the joins of armor. Think of it as a can opener designed for human-sized tin cans. Medieval chroniclers didn't mince words about what a warhammer could do. At places like Agincourt or Cressy, the men in the best gear didn't just worry about arrows. They dreaded facing someone with a warhammer. It was the medieval version of ringing your bell. Sometimes, men staggered off the field with helmets so dented they couldn't get them off without a metalworker's help. Accounts from the time tell us about knights lifted out of the mud, still breathing, only to find their skulls had been crushed underneath layers of steel. If you want to know whether these stories are for real, archaeologists have dug up proof. Actual skulls smashed flat, while still inside the helmet, bones broken clean through where no sword could ever reach. A big part of what made the warhammer so effective was plain physics. The whole idea was to concentrate every ounce of your strength into the smallest surface area possible. Imagine trying to crack a walnut with your palm. Good luck. But put all that force onto the tip of a hammer or a spike, and the shell doesn't stand a chance. Medieval weaponsmiths took this principle and ran with it. The warhammer evolved into all sorts of shapes. Some had long wooden handles for two-handed swings, others were short for quick, brutal blows up close. Sometimes they'd throw on extra features. Flanges to snag shields, hooks to trip even the best cavalry off their horses, or a curved beak to find its way into the nooks and gaps of armor. It was never just about brute force. It was about clever, ruthless design. And the warhammer wasn't limited to just swinging at people in armor. During siege warfare, some larger versions were powerful enough to break open doors, bash down barricades, or smash through weaker parts of fortifications. You'd even find English longbowmen carrying smaller hammers to finish off wounded enemies. If brute strength alone could win battles, the warhammer tipped the odds. In fact, some bigger infantry models could stretch out to 5 or 6 feet long. Imagine the reach and leverage you could get swinging one of those. It's not just talk. Museum replicas and armor tests prove the weight and balance were dialed in for maximum punishment. Warhammers were tough enough to cave in helmets, but light enough that you could swing them repeatedly in a fight. You didn't just get one lucky shot. You could pound away until your opponent stopped moving. The best part, if you owned armor, was realizing it now worked against you. The energy of each hit rippled through metal and straight into your bones. Even if the armor did its job and didn't break, you could end the fight with a concussion or a handful of shattered ribs. In the great medieval arms race, no weapon made armor wearers sweat harder than the warhammer. Fights suddenly became a lot less about fancy fencing and a lot more about raw, ugly power. One direct blow could make all that expensive equipment almost useless. But breaking a knight was one thing. What if your enemies weren't just single targets, but entire groups bearing down on you in formation? That called for weapons that could change the game for everyone, not just the unlucky guy on the receiving end. The answer took medieval warfare from one-on-one duels to a bristling wall of destruction. Think fighting in armor is tough? Imagine lining up on a medieval battlefield, not by yourself, but as one part of a giant human shield. Now instead of dueling, you're squinting across a field at another group, hundreds, sometimes thousands, moving together in a living wall bristling with spikes. You'd better hope you all practiced, because the magic of medieval warfare wasn't about lone heroes. It was about formations, sweaty teamwork, and the ability to not freak out when a bunch of angry horses charged at you. Back when knights on horseback were top dog, a group of heavily armored cavalry could plow through almost anything. For a long time, nobles with the most expensive armor, fast horses, and big lances ran the show. But then came an answer that made rich knights and their dads rethink everything. Enter the pike, a weapon so long and awkward, it made anyone holding it look ridiculous, right up until someone decided to charge. Let's talk about why pikes mattered. When you look at one up close, it's basically a very long spear, sometimes so tall it towered over the people using it. We're talking 16, even 18 feet of sharpened wood tipped with steel. You didn't just poke people with it. When you and your friends stood shoulder to shoulder with your pikes pointed forward, you created a moving wall of pain. And this wasn't a random idea. This was a reaction to cavalry, which once ruled everything. If you Google pike square or schiltron, You'll see ancient woodcuts of men packed so tight together, you'd think someone promised the last survivor got free lunch. That portable palisade wasn't just great defense, it was the medieval version of a traffic spike strip. Knights and horses who tried their luck against it would find themselves turned into medieval kebabs before they could even swing their swords. Now, cavalry charges didn't just stop being dangerous overnight. Infantry had to get organized. They drilled for weeks, sometimes months, learning to move as one. And it wasn't just about holding still. These groups had to march, wheel, and even attack together. Pikes always pointed at anything foolish enough to get close. No one person could do it alone. The Swiss pike square was a portable palisade, ideally suited for both defensive and offensive actions in the open field. The Swiss, in fact, got a real reputation for turning these tactics into an art. They learned to lock pike butts and swing the heads in perfect unison, making their group an unstoppable force, whether they stood still or advanced. At the Battle of Sempach in 1386, Swiss pikemen took on Austrian armored cavalry, and, with these formations, came out ahead, even without much in the way of armor themselves. Okay, that was cool for keeping horses at bay, but what if the enemy wasn't charging head-on, or you needed something a bit more flexible? That's where the halberd comes in. The halberd, a versatile polearm combining an axe head, a spike, and a hook, was another crucial weapon in the evolution of infantry tactics. The halberd was the Swiss army knife of the battlefield. You could swing it like an axe to hack into armor, jab with the spike to keep enemies at a distance, and even hook riders right off their fancy horses. Not just for show, either. Real battles tested these weapons. You see it at Stirling Bridge in 1297, where Scottish infantry faced down English cavalry. Despite being the so-called underdogs, the foot soldiers, armed with pikes, halberds, and a serious dose of anger, held their ground and stopped heavily armored knights from taking the field. Being in a pike square didn't look heroic in paintings, but it did the job better than almost anything else at the time. The beauty and the curse of these weapons was that none of it worked without discipline. One soldier out of sync, and the formation crumbled. These weapons needed teamwork and discipline. One person alone was toast, but together, they were unstoppable. This shift changed more than how battles played out. It changed who got to be important in war. Suddenly, regular men with training and pretty basic gear could shut down armies of knights who'd spent their lives learning how to fight on horseback. And because these big, awkward formations worked so well, armies started relying on common soldiers, the so-called nobodies, much more than ever before. It's not a stretch to say this move away from dominating heroes toward group tactics actually made battles more fair. If by fair you mean a bit less deadly for the folks not born rich. Formations like this kept the upper hand until another nasty surprise appeared. Weapons that could blast through an organized line before most soldiers ever had a chance to swing or stab. When distance started beating muscle and metal, warfare changed again. Teams with the best training and gear couldn't relax, because now someone could ruin all that hard work from the other side of the battlefield. That's where ranged weapons start shaking things up. So what happens when you make armor so good that most people can't hurt you up close? Someone comes along and skips close combat entirely. Welcome to the age of ranged destruction, where the most dangerous weapon wasn't in your face, it was flying at you from across the battlefield. For centuries, armies bet on brute force and heavy metal. But suddenly, the longbow and crossbow changed the whole game. Now, the best armor on Earth didn't mean you'd go home in one piece. The crossbow looks a lot like a weird mix between a mini cannon and a bow turned sideways. It's famous for being the weapon anyone could pick up and use with very little practice. Didn't spend your childhood as an archer's apprentice? No problem. Grab a crossbow, point, and squeeze the trigger. Suddenly, even inexperienced soldiers were firing bolts able to punch straight through anybody's mail shirt. These weren't just ordinary arrows. They used short, thick bolts, sometimes all metal, that packed enough punch to make chain mail and leather feel just for show. In fact, the crossbow shot a shorter, thicker arrow, sometimes made of metal, called a bolt. These bolts could easily pierce European mail armor. And if you thought armor made you safe, one mistake could end your day. Stand still in range, and you might as well order a new tombstone. Now, the crossbow was no speed demon. This wasn't about rapid fire. Each shot took time to set up, but what it lacked in speed, it made up for in sheer stopping power and accuracy. For defending castles, or even trying to pick off men across broken ground, it became a staple. The stock and trigger system meant you could let the weapon do the hard work, instead of needing years of muscle memory. People even started making specialty bolts that could snap ropes or pierce shields, just to add to the long list of problems for defenders. On the other hand, the longbow took everything the crossbow did and turned it into the art of war. The English longbow wasn't something you could just grab and use. It took years to grow the muscles needed just to pull one back, and even longer to hit what you aimed at. The longbow, a weapon of mastery, offered rapid and devastating firepower. But all that practice paid off big time. Skilled archers could let loose a constant stream of arrows, each shot powerful enough to dig deep into steel and flesh. During a fight, a wall of longbowmen could fill the sky with arrows so thick it looked like the weather turned ugly. Want proof? Let's time travel to the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The English archers there didn't just slow down the French. They made history. Trudging through mud, the heavily armored French knights turned into easy targets, while the English, barely wearing armor, let their bows do the work. English archers turned the field into a graveyard for French knights. It's not a legend. Modern studies still dig up arrowheads found buried deep in armor plates. That means all those years training with the longbow paid off with real, devastating results. The French lost some of their most important nobles, showing the world that even the fanciest suit of armor was useless when the sky rained arrows. But it wasn't only about bows. Let's talk about the poleaxe, because if you made it across the field, things didn't get easier. Picture a 3-in-1 weapon, part hammer, part axe, and part wicked spike. The poleaxe got creative, targeting every little gap armor had to offer. Too many knights got a harsh lesson when they thought a full suit would make them unbreakable, only to meet the business end of a poleaxe and discover every joint was a weak spot. Then there was the medieval version of let's destroy everything, the trebuchet. It's basically what you'd build if you loved catapults, but wanted more chaos. The biggest of them all, nicknamed the Warwolf, was so huge it needed 30 wagons to cart it around. This beast could bring down an entire wall in a single shot, smash castle walls, fling burning tar, or just scare everyone inside half to death. Trebuchets weren't just for throwing rocks. If you stood anywhere near where its ammo landed, you were in for a really bad day. Ranged weapons didn't just poke holes in armor. They ruined the whole idea of what being safe meant on a medieval battlefield. Now, you couldn't rely on thick steel or a high fortress wall. Armies had to come up with fresh tactics every time someone built a better longbow, designed a deadlier trebuchet, or forged a poleaxe with more bite. Each new weapon forced a change, new shields, stronger armor, smarter formations. All because long-distance destruction changed what it meant to even show up to a fight. The arms race wasn't something you could win and walk away from. Whether you were an archer, a crossbow soldier, or a knight in full armor, every invention forced you to fix last week's problem or face extinction the hard way. From the crash of the Warwolf to the silent whisper of arrows overhead, the rules of war got rewritten, one brutal weapon at a time. But all these innovations weren't just about metal and muscle. They decided who walked off the field, and who never got back up, whenever armies gambled everything in the mud and chaos of medieval battle. Every time armor makers thought they had the advantage, someone on the other side showed up with a clever new weapon. That's the real story of medieval battles. Constant innovation and adaptation. As one historian put it, it wasn't just swords and shields. It was warhammers, crossbows, longbows, and massive trebuchets, each invented because someone needed a way to solve a deadly problem. These tools forced warriors and weapon makers to keep changing, right down to the smallest detail. So next time you imagine a medieval fight, remember all those brilliant, brutal inventions waiting just past the edge of your shield.